Today we're going to talk about independent and dependent variables. The independent variable is also known as the input, which we call x. The output is also known as the dependent variable, which we call y. And I'll explain more later as we go along about input and output so you can see what I mean. For today, I need to make sure that you know independent is your x, dependent is your y. In many of these problems that I'm going to go through, I'm going to ask myself this question today. What depends on what? And I'm going to do that so I can try to figure out which ones are my independent variables and which ones are my dependent variables. So I will ask this on several questions as we come to them. What depends on what? So let's get started. In this first example, it says, in the winter, more electricity is used when the temperature goes down, and less is used when the temperature rises. That's true. When it's really cold outside, we're going to crank that electricity up. And when it's not quite so cold, then we won't have to have the heater on as much. So, I have come up with the sentence, the amount of electricity used depends on the temperature. And hopefully that makes sense to you. The amount of electricity used depends on the temperature. So the thing that does the depending is called the dependent variable. So I'm going to write down amount of electricity. The thing it depends on is the independent variable. So that's the temperature. And just to practice, dependent variable is our y, and the independent variable is our x. Just to try to get that into our heads. Another way you might hear this worded sometimes is instead of the amount of electricity used depends on the temperature, you might hear it said the amount of electricity used is a function of the temperature. So I need to make sure that you are aware of both ways of how it might be said. The amount of electricity used depends on the temperature. The amount of electricity used is a function of the temperature. So this first thing that does the depending is a dependent variable. Or this first thing that's a function of something is the dependent variable. Okay, let's look at another one. Number 2 says the cost of shipping a package is based on its weight. So I have said the cost of shipping a package depends on its weight. And that's true. The more it weighs, the more it's going to cost. The less it weighs, the less it'll cost. So the cost of shipping a package depends on its weight. So the thing that does the depending is the dependent variable. So I'm going to just say cost here. And the thing it depends on is the independent variable, the weight. Just to make sure we have it in our brains, the dependent variable is our y, and the independent variable is our x. And then I just want to make sure we practice that other statement. The cost of shipping a package is a function of its weight. The cost of shipping a package is a function of its weight. Okay, so now we're going to have to try to figure out what depends on what. I haven't written them down yet. So this third example says a company charges $10 per hour to rent a jackhammer. I have to figure out what depends on what. Does the cost depend on how many hours you have the jackhammer? Or does the number of hours you have the jackhammer depend on the cost? Now for students who don't have very much money, you would probably say the number of hours you have the jackhammer depends on the cost. Because if you can't afford it, you're not going to use it very long. But you have to put yourself in a situation where maybe you're a construction worker and they have got to get their job done. And if it requires 10 hours of using the jackhammer, it requires 10 hours of using the jackhammer. It doesn't matter what the cost is. So in that regards, you have to think about the cost depends on the number of hours you have the jackhammer. So that's what I'm going to write down here. The cost depends on the number of hours you use the jackhammer. Okay, so which one is the dependent variable? That's right, it's cost. Whatever does the depending on, that is your dependent variable. And whatever it depends on, that's your independent variable. So the number of hours is your independent variable. Which one again is the y? That's right, the dependent variable is the y. And so that makes the independent variable the x, the number of hours. And remember, this could also say the cost is a function of the number of hours you rent the jackhammer. Okay, this one's going to be a little easier for you to think about. Number 4. A person's age from birth through age 18 and the person's height. What depends on what? Does your age depend on your height? Or does your height depend on your age? Think about which one makes the most sense. Does your age depend on how tall you are? Or does how tall you are depend on your age? And hopefully you think your height, how tall you are, depends on your age. So which one's the dependent variable? That's right, it's height. Whatever does the depending on, that's your dependent variable, also known as the y. And the thing it depends on, your age, that's the independent variable, also known as the x. Okay, number 5 is very similar to that one. It says a person's age from birth through age 10 and the person's weight. What depends on what? Does your age depend on your weight? Or does your weight depend on your age? What do you think? Does your age depend on your weight? Or does your weight depend on your age? And hopefully you think your weight depends on your age. That makes the most sense. So the dependent variable would be our weight, which is the y, and the independent variable would be our age, which is the x. Another way to think about independent and dependent, besides just asking that question, what depends on what, is which one is more likely to vary? Which one is more likely to change over time? Your weight is more likely to vary. It's more likely to change. So that's one reason why we call it the dependent variable. It's more likely to vary. It's more likely to change. The independent variable, this is something that's not going to get affected by much. It's set in stone. It's solid. You're going to just keep getting older every year. First you're a year old, then you're 2 years old, then you're 3 years old, then you're 4 years old. It doesn't matter what you weigh, what you don't weigh. You're just going to keep getting older and older and older every year. That's something that's more set in stone. It doesn't get messed with very easily. It's independent. It doesn't rely on anything else. You're a year, then 2 years, and 3 years, and 4 years, and 5 years. So your independent variable is something that's more likely to be set in stone, and your dependent variable is something that's more likely to vary. It's more likely to change. And your weight is more likely to vary, to change over the years. than your age. Your age isn't getting affected by anything unless you have some tragic accident or illness. Okay, so age is something that's solid, consistent. You just get a year older every single year. Okay, let's try some more. Number 6 here says the number of times per week the lawn is watered and the height of the grass. What depends on what? Do you think the number of times you water the grass depends on the height of the grass? Or do you think the height of the grass depends on how many times you water it? Which one makes the most sense? Does the number of times you water the grass depend on its height? Or does the height of the grass depend on how many times you water it? Hopefully you think the height of the grass depends on the number of times you water it. So which one is the dependent variable? That's right, it's height. Whatever does the depending on, that is your dependent variable, also known as the y. Your independent variable is the thing that it depends on, how many times you water. Which is the x. Now let's think about it in regards to what I said a minute ago. The dependent variable is something that's more likely to change. The height of your grass is more likely to change. It's more likely to get influenced by other factors, whether you get a lot of rain, whether you water your grass, whether you don't water your grass, it's more likely to change. Okay, let's try number 7. The age of a tree and how tall the tree is. Do you think the age of the tree depends on how tall the tree is? Do you think how tall the tree is depends on its age? I'm going to ask it again. Do you think the age of the tree depends on how tall it is? Or how tall the tree is depends on its age? And hopefully you think it's the height of the tree, how tall it is, depends on its age. So our height, that's the thing depending on. That's the dependent variable. The thing it depends on, our age, is our independent variable called the x. The age of the tree, that is something that's set in stone. Nothing's messing with it. The tree's a year old, 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old. That is not getting changed. It's not getting affected by much. It's independent. Whereas the height of the tree, that depends on how tall it is. The height of the tree is more likely to vary. So it is dependent. Okay, let's try this number 8 here. It says, Susan gets paid $7 per hour. How much will she earn if she works 8 hours in a week? So we need to figure out, does the amount Susan gets paid depend on how many hours she works? Or does how many hours she work depend on what she gets paid? Does what she gets paid depend on how many hours she works? Or does how many hours she works depends on what she gets paid? I'm hoping you think the amount she gets paid depends on number of hours she works. The amount she gets paid depends on the number of hours she works. So which one's our dependent variable? That's right. It's the amount she gets paid, which is the y. And which one's the dependent variable? That's right. It's the number of hours worked, which would be the x. So the amount she gets paid depends on how many hours she works. If you were thinking the number of hours she works depends on what she gets paid, that's like you saying, I'm only going to work 5 hours if you pay me this much. I'm only going to work 10 hours if you pay me this much. It doesn't work that way. So what she gets paid depends on how many hours she works. And then, remembering back to the first page, there was another way of saying this sentence, not using the word depends on. Do you remember what it was? The amount she gets paid is a function of the number of hours she works. The amount she gets paid is a function of the number of hours she works. Okay, I'm going to save these bottom questions for when you guys come back to class, but I just kind of want to put a little bit of a summary down for you to look at. If you felt like you needed to write this down somewhere, then you could do that, but I just kind of want to go through it. Your independent variable is your x. Typically, things that are independent are like units of time, things that are not likely to vary. They're set in stone. Example, hours. Hours keep going by. First you have an hour, then 2 hours, and 3 hours. Weeks. Weeks keep going by. First you're in the first week, second week, third week, fourth week. Days, years, your age. These are things that are typically independent. Nothing messes with them much unless it's tragic. Dependent, these are your Y's. These are things that are likely to change. They're likely to vary. Examples, your weight, that fluctuates a lot. It varies a lot. Your height, that fluctuates. It varies. It changes. The cost of something, that changes all the time. Amount you earn, that changes depending on what your salary is, how many hours you work. The amount you pay for something, that depends on what it is you buy, what the cost of it is. So these are things that are likely to change, likely to vary, likely to fluctuate, called dependent. And independent, these are things that are set in stone. Nothing's messing with them unless it's just something really tragic. Thank you, and we will finish the rest of this in class just to try to make it make sense. And don't forget our little smiley face. Thank you so much.